We like to say that there are many, many ways to accommodate public access. And in fact, that's one of the requirements within our standard. These can be huge enhancements to properties. And we still need to really enjoy and take all the benefits from water, even as this environment is changing and even as climate change bears down.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today, I'm speaking with Cortney Koenig Worrall, President and CEO of Waterfront Alliance. Cortney, thanks for chatting with me today.
Great to be here.
Talk to me. So before you were CEO, you started with a conviction. Take us back. Why the environment? Why does it matter?
Yeah. Well, it started at a very, very young age. My family, my long ago family, is from northern Wisconsin, and it was all about the woods and environment and fish and hunting and all types of things. So I've had an affinity for the environment my whole life. And early in the 1970s, when I was growing up, there were some really bad things that were in the news, and toxic waste, Love Canal had been a major issue. The EPA was just started. And I really just honed in on thinking about what the environment was. And it led me to a career path. And amazingly, it led me into working a lot in water. And that wasn't really the plan. But when I started working in the professional world in the early 90s, that was when the Clean Water Act was really expanded to take a look at stormwater pollution. And there were a lot of jobs in stormwater regulation related work. So I worked in engineering consulting in stormwater, and water has been kind of the constant theme in so much of what I've done.
Super interesting. So where to begin? If I'm a commercial building owner today, amidst rising regulations, amidst the changing ways that we work and folks now working from home, with rising demand in housing, there's so much going on that it seems like climate is almost something that we kind of know we have to deal with, but it always seems as kind of a back burner thing. How can a building owner even begin to know where to begin? Like what's important for them to know?
Well, if your building is in a city like New York City or other major cities that have passed laws that require energy efficiency, you got to start there. Of course, what's required? What is required of me? And what is required that is really above and beyond the standard? And looking for the consulting help that you can get for that is just really critically important. But one thing to start with in terms of energy efficiency and resilience is that if you're in a location where there aren't minimum requirements, then you have to look at what's going to happen down the road and get prepared. So number one, there will be eventually more strong regulations on emissions. So doing something above and beyond code or standards is probably a really good idea. When it comes to climate resilience, so how resilient is your building or your property to the impacts of climate change? Just know that the impacts are accelerating and that we are in a position now in 2024 that most scientists thought we'd be in the late 2030s. And so what it means is that the Earth's systems are responding more quickly to carbon dioxide and methane primarily. And the Earth is in an atmosphere right now that was common more about millions of years ago. And so it's going to take many, many years to centuries actually for the Earth to eventually equilibrate to this amount of greenhouse gas emissions we have in the atmosphere. It's similar to watching a pot boil. It takes a really long time. If you imagine the size of the Earth, it's just going to take a long time. So only the message being that you may not be seeing a lot of changes directly, especially if you're in a location that hasn't received a lot of flooding or major climate impacts, but it's definitely coming. These emissions that have been baked into the system are going to cause major changes to the Earth over time.
What was the turning point, or maybe series of turning points that have gotten us to where we are today? And maybe to put it into context, are there any numbers or something to kind of put into context, like what actually is happening? I think when we talk about climate change, we kind of know in the back of our mind, like, this affects all of us. I know certainly on my day-to-day, I think about the amount of buildings in the world, and it's in the billions. But sometimes these numbers kind of do us a disservice because they kind of abstract us. We don't even know what this means. But how do we even begin to kind of take stock as to what needs to happen, and maybe starting with what was the catalyst, what was the turning point?
Well, just a little bit of history. So in the 1880s, actually, a scientist predicted that this was going to happen, that the industrialization that was happening in Europe and in the United States eventually would lead to carbon emissions that would potentially change the atmosphere. So it's been known scientifically for quite a long time. And it got, I think that the serious environmental and scientific community was looking at climate change as a major impact in the 1980s. So I think that history, people don't realize, is much longer, especially within the scientific community. In terms of public perception, I think that some major things started to happen early on in the New York, New Jersey region, which is where the Waterfront Alliance is based. Hurricane Sandy was devastating to the city. Just an example is that there was a subway station in Lower Manhattan that had just been opened. It was newly remodeled and it filled up with water. It filled up with salt water. All of the electrical systems, the wiring, the rails, et cetera, were rusted because of that. And it was a complete redo. So that was where the awakening really happened, I think, here. So how to take stock of this? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Like where do you even begin?
Right.
Yeah. Well, first of all, so I've been talking about catastrophe. So hopefully you haven't, stopped listening, because this sounds like really, really, really bad news. But every little bit counts and every little bit helps. And so I would say one thing that has been bothering me for a while is that there's been a lot of emphasis on individual action. So make sure you compost. Don't drive it so much. Maybe get rid of your car, that type of thing. Use recycled products. All of that's really, really important. But what we really need is systemic level change. And anything you can do in terms of the building systems that you're responsible for, or the system within your community that influences how your building functions or how your property functions, make sure you're on the right side of that conversation. Make sure that you're understanding that these changes are coming no matter what we do. You can't wish them away. So how can I be a part of changes that have to happen at system level, both in terms of my environment and my government or my city, but also in terms of my building? And also to not feel defeated. I think there's an emotional component of this too, where people feel completely overwhelmed when they hear really bad news, like what I'm delivering right now. But I think there's strength in numbers, there's community in numbers. Get involved with consultants who are really on top of this, and you'll find that there's a feeling of accomplishment when you can start to make a difference.
I promise I'm going to ask you the more optimistic questions and what is success, but just to further kind of understand this, I am curious to dive in deeper. What are the levers that have the highest impact? You talked about systemic change, and there's no kind of single lever to pull. How do you think about what are the ones that have kind of the highest return to make the biggest impact immediately?
Yes. So there are two things. One is decreasing carbon dioxide or methane and methane emissions. So decarbonization. So anything that you're doing with your building that reduces those emissions and makes your building more environmentally efficient, which also, frankly, will save you money, is just really, really important. And then the second part is making your buildings or making sure that we're resilient to the effects of climate change. So when it comes to resilience, what's really important is recognizing that storms are going to be increasing in intensity. So that's wind, snow, extra snow, more rain. If you have a coastal property, the property is going to potentially be hit by major storms that have huge storm surges that come in. And that's what happened in Lower Manhattan, which I just described. But also related to that is that sea level rise will increase. So you'll have over time water coming in higher and higher at each high tide. And then the other thing is that you'll have huge fluctuations in water levels for rivers and in-stream and inland non-saltwater related environments. So recognizing those impacts and also, let me just say, extremes in temperature. So heat and extreme cold. So heat and extreme cold is actually a global warming phenomenon. And that's because hot and cold don't mix very well. So the more hot air we have and the colder air we have, the more likely they are to stay in that condition and not mix. And so that's why we'll be finding over time extremes in weather of heat and cold as well. So preparing for those. So obviously every single site is very, very different. So it's about how do you identify what is going to be the biggest impact in your location, getting that from your government or from consultants. And then how do you design or how do you prepare or make more resilient or rebuild or remodel to meet those impacts for the long term, to protect your investment, to make sure that you are leaving a livable location, basically for future generations.
To me, this is so fascinating because I think that I have to imagine that at this stage, very few folks would argue with the science. Now, I'm sure there's extremists, but for a building owner who's maybe facing the perfect storm of, I just put myself in the shoes of someone here in New York City who they want to do the right thing. They have, for example, a commercial office building, but this perfect storm is the intersection of a decreased demand in offices. So presumably they've got not very many folks renting right now. So which means they're probably struggling to pay their mortgage, which means they're trying to scramble what to do. That combined with increased interest rates, making borrowing harder, making construction costs more. The thought of improving my assets right now is probably second to just simply being able to pay the bills. How can building owners, or frankly, the entire ecosystem, think about what to do when right now there's this kind of scrambles? Like, I mean, yes, improving the building is one thing, but just I don't even know if I'm going to be able to keep this building in the short term in the next few years.
Well, there is, as you know, a great need for housing in this country. It's bad in New York City. It's bad everywhere. And housing prices are going up. Is there a way, and I'm sure your guests have talked about this in the past, but is there a way that we can reconstruct some of this office supply into housing and create urban and downtown centers that are really appealing and wonderful places to live in? And how can that economic model really work to also incorporate resilient and climate friendly and greenhouse gas reducing designs? I think that's the answer. And if you tie it into housing and you're involved at the levels where these housing debates are taking place, I think that's probably a key policy area to work in. That seems to me like that's really going to be the future.
Do you see rising legislation, anyone that particularly stands out as like having positive impact that you've seen recently is like, hey, this is actually making real impact here? Or does anything stand out to you?
Do you mean like at the local level or federally, or?
Perhaps maybe curious if you have a take on both federal and local levels, what might be examples of success?
Well, the biggest at the federal level is the passage of the infrastructure bill. And so that wasn't the bill that progressives were hoping would be passed. That was more of the climate bill. But the great thing about the infrastructure bill is that it has been structured so that so many of the projects that are funded by federal projects that are funded by this bill are meant to be climate positive, like improving emissions reductions, et cetera, and also climate resilient. So it's also a boost to the economy. There's more information about that. So the environmental and climate change community that we're a part of, the Waterfront Alliance, has been really able to take great advantage of promoting all these opportunities that have come through the infrastructure bill. And the bill is also incentivizing some of the best in the technology that's needed to change to different fuels. Hydrogen is one great example of a fuel that we're not hearing a lot about right now, but I think really will be taking center stage in terms of an alternative fuel. And there's a huge amount of investments that are going into that, which it's federal investments. So that's really important. At the state level, you have states that are passing laws that require the state to have a climate plan. And some states in the country have maintained the commitment to the Paris Climate Accord that was dropped under the Trump administration. And that's been really good. What's happened in New York State and in New Jersey, for example, is that the states have been promoting offshore wind and also investing in it, not only promoting, but investing tremendous amounts of public dollars. Offshore wind is a great way for bringing in absolutely the cleanest energy into the grid, which means that buildings don't have to necessarily go completely carbon zero because the energy that they're bringing into the building is already so much renewable energy in it. So it's to the building industry's benefit to advocate for these larger renewable energy projects, because then what's going to be forced on individual buildings won't be so great because they're already drawing renewable energy off of the grid. So, and then at the local level, there's all kinds of stuff to talk about. We have all said many times that really a lot of the biggest changes are going to happen at the local level in terms of regulations and legislation, especially as Congress is stalled right now. But in terms of what has to happen, I think state and local changes are really where it's at.
And I want to commend you. I think your work at Waterfront Alliance, I think, is doing a great job of kind of being a few steps ahead. I mean, you recently launched the kind of 2024 policy priorities.
Yeah, that's right.
What's in it?
Well, a lot of stuff. So first of all, we want funding for really good public projects that are climate resilient and plan for this future that we're talking about. We want to pass legislation that protects local communities from the impacts of climate change and make sure that those communities have plans, that there is a statewide plan, that offices and departments within government for climate change are funded as well. And one thing that's really important that is in there and really I think speaks to more of what the building community would be interested in hearing specifically from Waterfront Alliance about is that we have a program called the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines. So this was a program started over 10 years ago. It functions very, very similarly in structure to the LEED energy efficiency standard. But what it's for is it's for waterfront projects. So it's for a building or a development that's happening any place where water meets land. Where water meets land is, as we've just been discussing, one of the locations of ground zero for climate change. That's where things are going to really be changing. And so what we can offer, if a real estate developer or a building owner or project owner is interested, they can go through the Waterfront Alliance and we will verify that the project has met the highest standards for climate resilience, for ecology, and for community responsiveness. And so this was a program that was developed over 10 years ago. It works for all land use types except for single family residential. It's coastal as well as freshwater. And so our policy platform has a lot to do with making sure that our program, and by the way, the acronym is WEDG, WEDGE, that the WEDGE program is incentivized and that it is a part of municipal planning and municipal regulations as well, because once everybody has to comply to these higher standards, I think it's going to be easier for everyone. The costs will go down, et cetera. Anyway, there's so much to say about that program, but it is one of the best tools that allows for not only the structure and the content that allows for projects and the landscape of any location to be designed in the right way for the future, but it also is a way of showcasing those developers and those property owners who have gone above and beyond. A lot of these changes we're talking about are invisible. You can't see carbon emissions leaving a building. You can't see whether or not a project is actually going to be resilient to the heaviest storm or the worst type of storm surge that's going to come in. And so how do you make these changes and these commitments visible, especially when some of them are pretty expensive? So through our program, you can get that visibility, that recognition, and be considered, your property will be then seen as one of the properties meeting the gold standard nationally.
Talk to me about the design. So you talked about the importance of where, water meets land. What is good design? Like what does the kind of average person not know about that very critical kind of juncture?
Well, good design takes into account the fact that we will see sea level rise. So if it's a coastal project, the ocean will be coming in. And it'll be coming in 3 to 5 feet, more, potentially more, just depending on the location. So that edge is not going to look the same 10, 15, 20 years from now. Also, one thing people don't really realize, but you do if you go snorkeling, is that it's one of the most productive, ecologically productive locations you could ever find on a site. More and more aquatic animals and insects and organisms and all types of things really depend on water and land and where those locations meet. And so there's a ton going on ecologically right there. So in terms of what we need to change in design, and one of the parts of our wedge standard is that when you're making these changes to prevent damages to your property from climate change, you're also designing in a way that enhances the ecology of the site. Ecological concrete can be used, et cetera. And all these things make for a really robust ecosystem In Stockholm, you can fish in the water surrounding Stockholm. You potentially could fish if we had enough of these projects that met these high standards, be fishing in the middle of New York City and be able to actually potentially over time even eat the fish. You can't do that now, that's for sure. But so anyway, those are some things to think about, that these are very, very, very special places. Why do we love water so much as a species? We love water for the same reasons that a lot of different life on Earth does as well. And so these are very special, very unique places. So in terms of what types of designs can be really, really helpful in the future, it's moving back buildings so that they either are out of the floodplain or that they are elevated and moved back so that when the storm surge comes, the storm or the water does not flood or take these, take out essential parts of the building. The other is elevating critical infrastructure within buildings, that type of thing. And then I guess I would say the last aspect of this is that and this isn't exactly answering your question, but the recreational opportunities on properties, either for your tenants or for the public, we like to say that there are many, many ways to accommodate public access. And in fact, that's one of the requirements within our standard. These can be huge enhancements to properties. And so and we still need to really enjoy and take all the benefits from water, even as this environment is changing and even as climate change bears down.
I think your perspective is so refreshing because what I can't help but to think about is that what you're outlining is kind of like a multi-part effort that's really part of all of our responsibilities here. On the one hand, you're saying we need to be more proactive with our impact on our emissions, as well as be much more proactive with our resilience programs. Let's say we're not able to do anything about our emissions for whatever reason.
Right.
So we could design our buildings better and be more proactive. But you mentioned a stat that's actually quite alarming. Like in 15, 20 years, if seawater levels are rising at 3 feet, 5 feet, what's to say they're not going to continue rising by 10 or 20 or 30 feet, given enough time? So I'm thinking of like two different levers. On the one hand, we kind of have to do something about the current state of the rate at which, I guess, emissions are going into the environment, while at the same time kind of proactively designing our buildings and our waterfronts in different ways. Is that kind of the juggle right now between, proactively, reducing our efforts while at the same time redesigning our waterfronts? Yeah.
They're not in conflict with each other. So preventing climate change and preparing for climate change need to go hand in hand. Number one, that's if we were to stop emitting all carbon dioxide and methane today, the planet will still keep warming up because of these historic emissions. So I think my major advice is that if you're concerned or you think that there's no way that we can make a difference in terms of decarbonizing, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we have the technology, we have the answers. So much of what we can do actually will be not only the investment in the future that we want, but if you're a person who owns a business within the world of the technology needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you know that these technologies can actually be a huge economic driver. So as a building owner or as a property owner, supporting the industry that eventually needs to really come online even stronger to make these decarbonization changes is just really, really important. So even if you can't do anything right now, I think being a part of the conversation and being a part of supporting this, all the things that have to happen for this change for decarbonization is really important. For resilience, I think in so many ways, it's about just raising awareness about the fact that this is in many, many ways not very visible, the changes that are going to come, that they are going to come. And any amount of investment you make in making your property more resilient to impacts of climate change, you will get a huge return on investment. There is a study that shows that for every dollar invested in climate resilience, there's a $6 return. So it's a return that will pay over time, and it's just a really important concept to understand and to look into how this can work for your locations.
Can I imagine maybe a reasonable objection to this is just a high initial investment? as compared to, say, traditional design or construction standards today? Is that generally what folks push back on?
I think that's true. And that's why I think there are huge levels of systemic change we need to look at. The insurance industry needs to come up with some more creative solutions. So we know that the insurance industry is abandoning certain markets. And I think that consumers of any type of insurance related to properties or buildings or built environment really need to push the insurance industry to offer new types of products that would make that investment in these changes much, much more incentivized. Or potentially you can receive, there are ways to structure our financial system to make it much easier to borrow in order to build in this long-term investment and these protections. So I would say it's insurance, but also the financial industry is not where it needs to be. So we absolutely get it. And I think that this is, again, why this starts to move into, it's not advocacy. If you're not into advocacy, no problem. It's about being involved in these conversations and making sure that you're pushing what you can to make sure the market is starting to respond to what these changes really are, even though they're in many, many ways not visible. They're visible if you watch the nightly news and you're seeing the fires and the extreme weather and all of that. But we're not all paying attention to that, and there's a way of tuning out. But I think it's about kind of recognizing that this is happening.
What's the most exciting victory that you've seen to date? When kind of an example of success? What's a project that you think is like, this one really, really crushed it?
Big picture stuff. It's mostly for what I would say in terms of big picture and public investment. It's the offshore wind industry in New York and New Jersey. Huge game changer, huge job creator, economic engine for sure, in so many ways. And there have been some hiccups, but hopefully you've caught some of the really good news that's come out in the last couple of weeks about things getting restarted with some of the offshore wind developments. So it's really going well. I would say in terms of projects that have really adhered to and met the standard for the WEDGE program that we have. There are a couple examples that we really, really love. One is Jose Marti Park in Miami, which is designed but not constructed yet, where it's a park in an underserved community, and it's going to be a beacon for climate resilience and recreation, and also ecologically sound and climate mitigating structures within the park. In terms of industrial facilities, McGinnis Cement in the Bronx is an example of a project that adhered very well, was verified by our program for WEDGE verification, and it's an industrial facility that meets the highest standards for climate resilience, for ecology, and for public and community resilience and access, which is just amazing. And then there are other projects as well that they're in New York City in terms of housing development. Hunts Point is also a huge example in Queens, where these projects have really come together in terms of providing benefits to the community, huge benefits for the developer and the owners, and are showing really the way that we can live in the future and what the future is going to look like. These projects will survive the test of time. We're anticipating far, far into the future, decades into the future.
One of the things that makes this particular topic both super pressing and important is there's a need, like we cannot afford to not think 50 years into the future or 100. In my personal life, I found out recently my wife and I are expecting a little girl here in August. Yeah. Awesome. And while, embarrassed to say that, not that we're not long-term thinkers, but now it forces you to think, what does the world look like in 50 years or maybe even 100 years? This is something that I never considered. And my question to you is, if we're successful here, doing what we have to do, making the right investments, and shifting some of our priorities, what does our housing and work and parks look like in 50 years if we're successful? What are some of the principles that are likely to be true?
So first of all, it will look different and it won't look different. In terms of the dense built environment, it'll be much more green. There'll be green roofs. There'll be green growing on the sides of buildings. And that's because as we know, anything green, trees in particular, are huge carbon absorbers. So they're to not only does green cool off the very, very hot city, but it also captures carbon dioxide, which is huge. I think we're going to see communities where the waterways have really changed the outward appearance, especially if you think about New York Harbor. It will look a bit different for sure. That the elevations along the edge of Lower Manhattan will be much higher. There will also be huge green parks and wonderful ways that people are enjoying these higher elevations. The walls will be built, but they won't look like walls. They'll look like huge parks because the wall is built and then the park kind of extends above it. So it'll be really, really interesting to see how that changes. We'll also see some neighborhoods that just cannot stay, and commercial districts that are close to the water, freshwater or saltwater related locations that just won't exist anymore because there's no economic justification for rebuilding in these locations after impacts. There will be some times when we'll have neighborhoods or communities where actually it was planned that they do have to leave, and there's a whole program to allow for this long transition. But as those programs are very slow to come online, huge impacts from major storms may actually mean that communities don't come back. And so you'll see the landscape of entire areas sometimes really changing. And I think one thing the Waterfront Alliance just really feels strongly about is that there's still a lot of recreation and fun on the water in all types of ways. And that even though water is where so much stuff is going to change and happen, we cannot wall ourselves off from it. There are huge emotional, well-being, health-related benefits from water. And so we just need to really capture those opportunities as we're rebuilding and redesigning all of these locations.
Cortney, your leadership is so commendable, and your perspective is so refreshing. I thoroughly enjoyed, I think, hearing your perspectives, and I can't wait to have you on as a part 2. If folks wanted to follow you or support you in meaningful ways, where do they find you?
Great. Well, before I say that, I need to correct myself. I said Hunts Point for the location of one of those projects. It's Hunters Point South in Queens. So just Hunters is different than Hunts Point. So in New York.
Fair.
Okay.
Fair.
So to find out more about us, just go to waterfrontalliance.org. And you can also find in there Waterfront Alliance and the Wedge program under what we do, WEDG, Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines. If anyone is interested in hearing more about the standard and how it works and how we can help, and there's tons of work that we do with all of our clients to make it a great process, just let us know. And then also our conference is coming up in Lower Manhattan on May 21st. And all of the topics we just talked about and more are part of the program. And please join us then.
I can't wait to be there myself. So thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast. I really loved the questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much.